Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will come to order pursuant to Clause 2 Committee Rule 5B and House Rule 11-2H4. The Chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote on the yeas and nays is recorded are ordered. And without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Our first item for consideration today is H.R. 1671, the Government Neutrality and Contracting Act. Clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 1671, to preserve open competition and Federal government neutrality towards the labor relations of Federal government contractors on Federal and federally funded construction projects.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objections, so ordered. I'd like to recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Mulvaney of South Carolina, for 5 minutes to explain his legislation. Mr. Mulvaney, you are now recognized.
I thank the Chairman. Very briefly, back in 2009, Mr. Chairman, the President issued an executive order that encouraged, didn't require, but it encouraged Federal agencies to require project labor agreements on Federal construction projects that were bigger than $25 million. A PLA is something something not everybody is probably familiar with. It is something that is unique to the construction industry, and it requires general contractors and subcontractors to agree to recognize unions as the representative of their employees. It requires them to use the union hall, even requires them to follow union work rules and pay into union benefit and multi-employer pension programs, even if they don't have union workers. Many of us have believed for a long time that this is an unfair disadvantage to non-union labor, which is prevalent throughout the South, especially where I'm from. The bill is very modest. All it does is undo the executive order by doing two very limited things. Number one, it prohibits the Federal agencies from requiring contractors to sign project labor agreements as a condition of getting the contract. So it doesn't allow them to require it, number one. Number two, it prohibits giving a preference for those contractors who offer to use PLAs. So all it does is really level the playing field, does not ban them, does not disallow them, does not put anybody at a disadvantage if they want to try and use it. It simply levels the playing field between union and non-union labor and contractors that use union and non-union labor. I've got folks down south who've been paying into a pension fund and into a multi-employer benefit plan for years that they probably will never get a chance to use. So it's unfair to those folks and to the folks who hire those folks to give a preference for the PLA. So all we're trying to do with this bill, Mr. Chairman, is to level the playing field, to give everybody an even chance at getting a piece of these government contracts. With that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the member. I would also note the long list of members on the Republican side of the aisle have co-sponsored this bill. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes for any statement he might have on the bill.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to H.R. 1671, the so-called Government Neutrality and Contracting Act. Many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have repeatedly argued that the government should function more like a business. Yet today we're considering legislation that would prohibit the Federal government from using project labor agreements, also known as PLAs, to achieve efficiencies in construction, even though PLAs are widely used by the private sector to contract for labor or construction projects.
The gentleman will suspend and we'll go into recess for a moment.
No, I didn't see it.
The committee will come to order, and we will come back into session. I believe we had Mr. Cummings continued to be recognized.
And yet today, we are considering legislation that would prohibit the Federal Government from using project labor agreements to achieve efficiencies in construction, even though PLAs are widely used by the private sector to contract for labor or construction projects. The real purpose of H.R. 1671 is to overturn Executive Order 13502, which was issued in 2009 by President Obama to attack our nation's organized labor unions. Executive Order 13502 does not, and I repeat, does not require the use of PLAs on any Federal contract. The executive order states that a Federal agency, and I quote, may, on a project-by-project basis, require the use of a project labor agreement where use of such an agreement will, number one, advance the Federal Government's interest in achieving economy and efficiency in Federal procurement, producing labor management stability and ensuring compliance with laws and regulations governing safety and health, equal employment opportunity, labor and employment standards, and other matters and consistent with law. End of quote. In other words, the executive order encourages agencies to use PLAs if they will protect the investments of taxpayers' money in major infrastructure projects. However, if H.R. 1671 were passed into law, a Federal agency would not be able to require the use of a PLA, even if the agency found that a PLA would be in the taxpayer's best interest and would achieve economy and efficiency in procurement. GAO has previously reported that PLAs, and I quote, have been used in all 50 states and the District of Columbia on Federal, state, local government, or private sector construction projects, end of quote. GAO also found that PLAs have been used extensively by the private sector, including on projects like the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and Disney World. PLAs are routinely used by firms like Toyota and Walmart. In fact, the PLA was even in place for the construction of the proposed Keystone XL pipeline. Let me say that again. The Keystone XL pipeline would have been built using a project labor agreement. According to a press release issued by TransCanada in September 2010, the PLA that TransCanada signed with several United States unions, including the Laborers International, Teamsters, and Plumbing and Pipe Fitters industry, was expected to, and I quote, provide TransCanada with a capable, well-trained, and ready workforce in the United States, end of quote. Many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have repeatedly sought to win construction approval for the Keystone XL pipeline. And yet, with this bill, they are seeking to forbid the Federal Government from using the very same construction management agreement that TransCanada planned to use for the Keystone project. This simply makes no sense. It makes no sense to tie the hands of the government by preventing it from using a project management process that the private sector regularly uses to hire labor for construction projects. It makes no sense to tell Federal agencies that even if they determine a PLA will protect the government, their use cannot be required. Rather than considering ideologically driven legislation that limits the ability of the government to ensure that taxpayers' money is spent effectively and efficiently, we should ensure that the Federal agencies can use management measures like PLAs if they will enable agencies to achieve greater efficiencies in contracting and advance the government's interests, which is precisely what the President's executive order does. I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 1671 and to reject offers to prevent Federal agencies from taking every available step to protect the taxpayers' money they spend on Federal construction projects. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I ask unanimous support to enter the January 11, 2016 letters from the American Builders Association and Contractors and a coalition of construction and business associations expressing strong support of H.R. 1671 at today's markup. The American Builders Association and the coalition of industry groups believe that H.R. 1671 will help increase competition, curb waste and favoritism in procurement of construction contracts. These groups support the Government Neutrality and Contracting Act because they believe it will create a level playing field, help small businesses, and curb Federal construction project costs.
Chairman, yield just for a second.
Yes.
I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record several letters we received opposing H.R. 1671, including letters from the AFL-CIO, the Association of Union Contractors, the Building Trades, and the Sheet Metal Workers.
Without objection, the letters that I offered in my UC, as well as Mr. Cummings, will be entered into the record. Without objection, so ordered. Now I'd like to recognize any other members wish to speak. We'll recognize Mr. Buck from Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Mulvaney.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado. Very briefly, in response to comments by the ranking member, many of them I find actually to be correct and factually accurate. For example, the Keystone Pipeline, to my understanding, is using a PLA. However, it is a private job. It's not a government job. A lot of folks think across the country, because of the level of debate it got in Washington, that it's a government program. It's not. It was a private job. And that private employer has decided to use union labor. They made that decision. It was not a government mandate. It was not done to save taxpayer money. It was a decision that that particular entity made. It's not relevant to this discussion. Furthermore, I believe Mr. Cummings said that the executive order does not require PLAs. True, sort of. It does, however, give an advantage, a preference. It tilts the playing field in the favor of those folks who are offering it. And that is the bias, the distortion in the market that we are seeking to redress with this particular bill. The one thing that Mr. Cummings said that I absolutely have to object to, however, because it's simply factually false, is that he said in his opening statement that this would prohibit the Federal Government from using PLAs. That's not true. That part is just not true. It would simply remove the bias that exists in favor of folks offering and go back to a level playing field between union and non-union labor and union and non-union contractors. So I think it's important that, well, we understand that some of the facts may be correct. The ultimate conclusion there is not accurate. We are not seeking to ban them at all, and I think that is worth noting. So with that, I yield back to the gentleman from Colorado and thank him for the time.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to express my strong opposition to H.R. 1671 with all due respect to the sponsor. This legislation seeks to reverse the executive order issued by the President that merely encourages but does not require Federal agencies to consider the use of project labor agreements. Specifically, it would prohibit the use of project labor agreements on Federal construction projects. Among the stated purposes of H.R. 1671 are to reduce costs to the Federal Government and to the American taxpayer, to promote and ensure open competition on Federal construction projects, and to expand job opportunities. Given that these are the same goals that are achieved when a management and labor representative agree on a construction job site to execute a PLA, 1671 would seem to be very counterproductive. Look, as a structural iron worker, before I came to Congress, I was an iron worker for about 20 years, and I've worked on a number of very large-scale projects where PLAs have been used. And first of all, I want to say that I've seen them used extremely successfully when properly drafted. I know that Harvard University had about $1 billion of work at the university back in the 90s. They brought in different labor groups and also contracting groups and said, we're going to put this out to bid, but we want a 10% discount on the wages paid during the course of this project, which was a multi-year project. They saved a lot of money. They used the leverage of that work to drive down the price and actually raise the quality of the work. They used that leverage that they had as an employer and as a principal. And so I've also seen some very complex projects adopt a PLA model where the scale of the project was so large that any time lost would have incurred huge costs to the government, huge costs to the taxpayer. And the availability of skilled labor during that project and making sure that no worker walked off that job, that there were no strikes, no interruptions in work, any failure of a contractor to perform. Under the PLA, the owner, the principal, had the ability to pull that contractor off that job and replace them. That was in the, and that contractor didn't have the right to sue. They had a right to go to arbitration, but the owner and the taxpayer had the leverage to pull that contractor off the job if they were working unsafely or weren't performing up to standards. So it all depends on what's in the agreement. PLAs are a good thing, but the terms of that agreement are very, very important. And you can require that contractors all abide by safety standards, worker compensation standards, skilled labor standards, minority participation standards, to make sure that if you're in an inner city where there's high unemployment among certain groups, you can make sure in that PLA you can say, we want to make sure that X number of workers come from the inner city to provide work opportunities. So there are all kinds of good things that you can obtain through a PLA. And by the way, we just did a 9-building PLA at University of Massachusetts where it was based on competition, based on price. And we had non-union contractors win the bid, and they went to work on that site. So this is not, as some would believe, just a competition between union versus non-union. It's between competitive versus non-competitive. And I think it's the way the contract is administered. That's really the crux of this. And I think that the one thing that the PLA does do, it prevents contractors, I believe, from paying some groups less. If you're hiring iron workers, your white iron workers are going to get the same pay as your black iron workers and Latino iron workers. There's not going to be your women are going to get the same pay as your men. So there is a certain leveling there. But I also think that competition won't be just simply on the backs of your workers. It'll be on the skill of those workers employed on that project, and also it will be planning and proper procedure and no breaks in the work schedule. I think there are a lot of things that can be accomplished on a wide basis by using a PLA if it's properly drafted. And so I don't believe that some of the fears that have been stated here and some of the typically we see these anti-PLA provisions put in at various points during the budget process, and they fail miserably. So, and there's a reason for that, because PLAs can work. They can save contractors and the taxpayer and the government a lot of money in the process of using them. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Does any other member wish to be heard on the bill? Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, is that right?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My friend from South Carolina says this isn't about prohibiting project labor agreements, but the language here kind of sort of does. It prohibits the head of any executive agency that awards construction contracts or obligates funds pursuant to such contracts to require or prohibit a bidder from entering into such agreements. Now, like my friend from Massachusetts, I was in local government for 14 years, and I had experience with project labor agreements. And in fact, we had a project labor agreement on Phase 1 of the Silver Line going from Washington, D.C. to Dulles Airport. It was a management tool. It was welcomed by both labor and management and by the local government that was primarily responsible for the funding of the project. But we had Federal money. This provision would have prevented local government from making its own decision about how to manage a critical construction contract that affects the whole National Capital Region, the largest transit expansion at that time in America. Project labor agreement gave us efficiency, gave us quality control, gave us workers who knew what they were doing, skilled workers, spread the benefits, and kept labor peace. PLAs grew out of wartime experience to keep war industries going and to maintain labor peace in a time of crisis. And they worked. And they worked. And they still do. So we can say this isn't really an assault on organized labor. This isn't really trying to prohibit PLAs as a management tool. But it kind of sort of is. H.L. Mencken once said, when they say it's not about money, it's about money. When they say it's not an assault on organized labor, it's an assault on organized labor. I join my friend from Massachusetts and the ranking member in opposing this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. And I would gladly yield to my friend from Massachusetts.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia for yielding. I do want to point out a couple of things that we're able to do in the course of PLAs. In Massachusetts, we have adopted PLAs that create job training and jobs for veterans, for women, for minorities, and low-income individuals within those PLAs. And I would ask unanimous consent to submit a media advisory and study entitled The Massachusetts Special Commission Report on the Use of Project Labor Agreements in Road, Bridge, and Rail Projects.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And I yield back to the gentleman from Virginia.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? Gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I really don't understand the notion that this doesn't ban project labor agreements. It essentially says that it uses the word discrimination to indicate that somebody is not acting on behalf of the government if they engage in a project labor agreement. When you consider the terms of the executive order, which does not require project PLAs, one wonders what the point here is. Now, there is, for example, in the District of Columbia, a huge project, the Department of Homeland Security complex. There is a project labor agreement here and there on that project. Most are not. The reason, of course, that the federal government would be interested in project labor agreements is because it is a very large project where you cannot afford to make mistakes. Great deal of negotiation goes on ahead of time if you have a project labor agreement and you are assured of top flight labor because you are dealing with a labor union which has trained apprentices, because you deal ahead of time with the notion of work stoppages. So I don't understand what the need for the executive order is, if not to discourage, and if you look at the language, I don't see how any agency head would feel free to engage in a PLA given this language and the notion that if you do a PLA, you are discriminating against another company that, for example, hires non-union labor. The government has to compete its jobs. It has got to decide what is the best price. If that is consistent with a PLA, then a PLA it should be, particularly for large projects where mistakes cost money. PLAs have been very useful. I strongly oppose this provision.
Gentlewoman yields back.
I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on the bill? Mr. Walker is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to yield some time to my friend Mick Mulvaney.
Very briefly, to my friend from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, I think I figured out why we can't get along, and that's because we don't agree with what the English language means. As you were encouraging me to read my own bill, I decided to go ahead and do it while you're reading it. I can't believe that you took the conclusion that you did from the language that was in front of you. How could anybody could read this to actually prohibit PLAs is just beside me. So I'll try and go through it very briefly. It says the head of each executive agency shall ensure that the agency does not require or prohibit a bidder from entering into an agreement. That's it. That's all that it is. That's the English language, that you cannot require them to enter into an agreement and you cannot prohibit them from entering into an agreement. So the exact thing that you said the bill does, it prohibits. I mean, I know that I'm getting frustrated here because it's just the English language. And you could say that it's really anti-union, and if you want to get to the motivations of why it is and why I'm a bad person, all that, that's fine. But you can't argue about what the language says. And the language says that we cannot require or prohibit. And you can't read that and say, well, what it really means is that it prohibits it. You can't do that. No wonder we can't get anything done around here. You back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I would remind members both sides of the aisle to address the chair rather than members directly, as per the protocol of this body. Does any other member wish to be heard on this bill? Gentlewoman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to yield my time to the gentleman from Virginia.
I thank my friend. You know, I actually take great care with the English language. I'm an English literature major, which is why I went into politics. Didn't qualify me for much. So there is a great sensitivity to language and what it means and what we're really getting at. But I would say to my friend from South Carolina, we may disagree about the meaning of language, but that doesn't mean we don't get along. And I would caution that the two must not be misconstrued. I certainly respect my friend from South Carolina and have found myself on the same side on some issues with him, and I hope in the future that will be true as well. The fact that we disagree about the exegesis of language in a bill does not mean anything in terms of our personal relationship, and I would hope we would, and I think he would agree. We need to keep those separate because otherwise this place won't function. But the right to disagree, the right to interpret what's really happening is absolutely the right of every member. And respectfully, we do disagree about the meaning of the language, but we certainly, at least on my part, that has nothing to do with my desire for personal friendship with the gentleman from South Carolina, nor my respect for the gentleman from South Carolina. And with that, I yield back to my friend from Illinois.
Thank you. I understand the gentlelady has agreed to yield additional time to me. Okay. Here's how this provision works in plain English. It prevents any contracting officer acting on behalf of the Federal Government to give any preference to anyone who signs a PLA. The reason the PLA works is because the people who enter into it are authorized to operate under it. In other words, if a non-union contractor and a union contractor come in together and they sign a PLA with the government, they are the contractors. They are getting a preference as to the rest of the world. Your provision says that the contracting officer cannot do that. You have to treat the people who are not participating in the PLA the same as the people who are signatory. So that guts, in plain English, it makes void the PLA. That's plain English, void. The PLA would be void under your provision because you can't recognize the people who have signed it. That's plain English, and that's what you're providing for here. So you need to maybe, well, I'll just leave it at that. But, and I'll yield back to the gentlelady.
Just inquiring of the gentleman from Massachusetts. When we have a situation where in other words, if the government found that it would be in their best interest to have a PLA, according to the language here in the bill, they could not require the contractors to use a PLA. Is that it?
Correct. Okay, if the government said, whether this is a non-union company out here that signed the PLA or a union company that signed the PLA, whether it was good for the taxpayer or not, the government under this provision would not be able to enforce that contract because it would not be able to treat the signatory differently than the non-signatories. It voids the entire effect of the contract. So that's the operative language of this bill.
One of the other things, Mr. Chairman, that we see in Baltimore, and I'm sure we see it all over the country, is that so often you have the big contracts and no PLA, and so often the local people, get no jobs or get very, very few. They're sitting on the sidelines watching people come into their neighborhoods, leave at the end of the day, spending money somewhere else. And each economy each local area wants to make sure that their local people are also having an opportunity to work. And jobs are so very, very important. So I'll yield back to the lady.
I yield back.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. I think if you look at page 3 of the bill, I find that the gentleman from South Carolina is correct, that if you start to read again at the top of page 3, or other controlling documents, does not, and then it lists out what it does not do. It does not require or prohibit a bidder, and then it goes on. It's not requiring it. It's not prohibiting it. It's allowing and improving, I think, competition. Point B, otherwise, it does not otherwise discriminate or give preference. I think that's the spirit in which the American way is. That's why I'm very supportive of this measure, and I appreciate Mr. Mulvaney for bringing this bill up. It's come before several Congresses before. I've co-sponsored it in the past. I think we can all read it. It's a fairly short bill. And with that, I will yield back my time. Does any other member wish to speak on this bill? Hearing none, are there any amendments to the bill? If none, the question is now on adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 1671 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no? No. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 3023, to amend Title V of the United States Code to modify probationary periods with respect to positions within the competitive service and the senior executive service. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 3023, to amend Title V United States Code to modify probationary periods with respect to positions within the competitive service and the senior executive service and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I'd now like to recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Buck from Colorado, for 5 minutes to explain this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In general, most positions within the Federal Government are subject to a one-year probationary period. H.R. 3023 extends the probationary period from 1 to 2 years. The probationary period provides the government with an opportunity to evaluate an employee's job performance to determine if an appointment to the civil service should become final. Before an appointment becomes final, an employee has limited job protections, and in general, an employee on probation may not appeal a removal action. After an appointment to the civil service is final, an employee receives considerable job protections under the Federal Merit System, including appeal rights to the Merit Systems Protection Board. In general, an appointment in the competitive service is not considered final until completion of a one-year probationary period, although there are exceptions requiring longer periods. Accepted service positions have a 2-year probationary period. Many jobs in the Federal Government are complex and take more than 1 year to learn the position, which makes it difficult to properly assess the performance of an employee in such a short period of time. The extension of the probationary period to 2 years provides managers with a proper amount of time to assess the performance of an employee. There are also positions within the Federal Government that require training programs, on-the-job training, or a licensing certification requirement based on the unique characteristics or complexity of the position. In these instances, the employee may not perform their full job duties for several months or years. In a February 2015 Government Accountability Office report on the Federal workforce, GAO found that supervisors feel they do not have enough time to observe the individual's performance in all critical areas of the job. GAO also found some supervisors were not making performance-related decisions about an employee and their likelihood of success because supervisors were not aware the probationary period was ending. H.R. 3023 addresses these concerns by extending the probationary period to provide supervisors with the sufficient time needed to properly assess a new employee, ensuring the employee knows what is required to successfully complete probation and requiring certification of such successful completion. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back my time.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that the committee's consideration of H.R. 3023 is premature and raises significant concerns. Like the other personnel bills on today's markup agenda, this legislation appears to be a solution in search of a problem. The committee has not yet examined whether there is a problem. We have not seen any evidence that the Federal agencies need a blanket 1-year extension of the probationary period for every Federal job in the competitive and senior executive service. This committee also has not determined whether a longer probationary period, as opposed to other actions agencies can take, would measurably improve their ability to deal with poor performance and further their mission. I understand that my Republican colleagues may cite as precedent the 2-year probationary period for the Department of Defense civilian employees set forth in the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2016 that was recently enacted into law. However, I understand that the Defense Department neither indicated a need for that change nor requested it in fiscal year 2016 legislative proposal. Along with other Democratic members on this committee, I joined a letter to the House and Senate Armed Services Committee raising concerns that such an extension of the probationary period would undermine due process rights, harm whistleblower rights, and hurt recruitment and retention. H.R. 3023 raises the same concerns. It would double the time period during which Federal employees have limited due process and appeals rights as probationary employees. During this time, they may be fired without 30 days' notice. They have limited rights to an attorney or representative, and they generally cannot appeal their removal. This is one step closer to making Federal employees at-will employees. Some of my colleagues believe that the probationary period is critical and even necessary for removing poor performers. But even after the probationary period ends, agencies can still fire underperformers. They just need to provide employees with 30 days' notice, an opportunity to respond, and appeal rights. These due process protections are necessary to protect against arbitrary agency actions, including retaliation against whistleblowers. This committee should be aware of the very real danger that unchecked agency action can have on whistleblowers. For example, the committee has examined incidents involving significant retaliation against whistleblowers at the United States Secret Service. According to a 2013 Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General report, and I quote, "Supervisors and employees describe the U.S. Secret Service as a small and competitive agency which can make fear of retaliation or alienation an issue," end of quote. The Inspector General also noted that in an employee survey it conducted as part of the 2013 report, 44% of the responders felt they could not report misconduct without fear of retaliation. As this committee considers H.R. 3023, we must avoid enacting legislation that would result in more whistleblower retaliation at Federal agencies. The Government Accountability Office also recently looked at the issue of probationary periods. In February 2015, GAO issued a report finding that agencies dismissed 3,500 employees in 2013 for performance reasons, and that most of these dismissals occurred during the probationary period. So it looks like the agencies are using the probationary period to conduct most of their performance-related firings. GAO concluded, however, that the probationary period, and I quote, could be more effectively used by agencies, end of quote. In other words, agencies are not using the one-year probationary period as much as they could. GAO also stated, and I quote, improving how the probationary period is used could help agencies more effectively deal with poor performance, end of quote. I believe that the key to helping agencies deal with poor performance is not necessarily lengthening the probationary period. Instead, it may be, as GAO recommends, improving how supervisors use this period of time to manage the performance and assessment of employees. GAO noted that some agency chief human capital officers they interviewed as part of their study said that a longer probationary period could be helpful in certain cases, but their comments were focused on specific occupations that are complex and difficult to assess. As I close, before damaging due process and whistleblower rights, we should first determine whether an extension of the probationary period is needed, and if so, whether it is appropriate for all Federal service occupations or only certain occupations. I intend to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute that would direct GAO to conduct a study that would help answer these critical questions. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Professional Managers Association dated January 11, 2016. Without objection, so ordered. Does any other member wish to speak on the bill? We're now ready to start the amendment process. Are there any amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3023, offered by Mrs. Lawrence of Michigan.
The gentlelady from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment in the nature of a substitute would strike the provisions of H.R. 3023 and add provisions requiring each employing agency to make an affirmative decision in writing stating that the individual's performance is acceptable. This would be required near the completion of an employee's probationary period. My amendment permits agency supervisors to take appropriate action on employees whose performance is acceptable, as well as those who exhibit poor performance. It also ensures that those supervisors clearly understand the start and the expiration of an employee's probationary period. Mr. Chairman, long before I came to Congress, I worked in human resources in a branch of the Federal Government. I served as an EEO investigator, and one of my responsibilities was to work with people who were filing a complaint because they were written up or at risk for termination during probationary period. Those issues were typically from minor infractions such as attendance, tardiness, and safety violations. But every once in a while, it was for more egregious violations like sexual harassment. Managers and employees must have defined rights, roles, and responsibilities. And it is up to the manager to set clear, defined expectations and to communicate those expectations. I spent a lot of time training managers on how to properly document employee performance issues. I trained supervisors about having direct communication with the employees that were both timely and transparent in explaining employees' duties as well as how to provide resources to help employees during that probationary period. And yet, I still found that some managers simply took the path of less resistance and complained without ever documenting those issues, allowing the employee to go from probationary to permanent. This was not a failure of time, but a failure of management training and documentation. The February 2015 GAO report supports my example. There is little evidence that suggests that doubling the length of the probationary period for federal employees improve government performance. Competent managers should be able to identify poor performances within a one-year period. A well-trained manager who documents his or her employee's performance should be able to easily confirm a stellar employee or remove a poor performer. Instead of rewarding incompetent managers who fail to properly supervise and document their employees' performance, we should be asking OPM to provide detailed and clear guidance to agencies to help managers use the probationary period and its performance assessment effectively. Supporting H.R. 3023 only creates anxiety among employees by lengthening their at-will status and does nothing to cure the true problem of training, guidance, and documentation. I urge my colleagues to support the federal workforce and vote in favor of this amendment. And I will also say to my colleagues, the probationary period and those managers who fail to use it properly are the issue that we need to hold managers accountable during this one-year process and time period. Any one of the members that are sitting here today who were responsible for managing employees in your own private company or in any industry clearly know that within a one-year period, you know if that employee is one that will add value, have the abilities and the skills to add value to your company or to the corporation you're working for, and another year will not change that employee's outcome, or it will not position you or give you anything more that you wouldn't see in a one-year period. So I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Bucks, now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment makes unacceptable changes to gut H.R. 3023, legislation that extends the one-year probationary period to 2 years for positions in the competitive service and the senior executive service so that there is sufficient opportunity to evaluate an employee's job performance. Specifically, this amendment strikes the entire bill and inserts a provision requiring that an appointment to competitive service shall not become final until the agency head has made an affirmative decision in writing 30 days before the end of the probationary period that the individual's performance is acceptable. However, defeating even the purpose of the written decision, if a written decision is not made, the appointment still becomes final. The amendment would maintain the status quo, which is exactly the opposite of what the American people have sent us to Washington to accomplish. This amendment strikes the bill's provision to extend the probationary period from 1 to 2 years and instead maintains the current one-year probationary period for career appointees and gives agencies 30 days to weigh in on the performance of staff before they are granted permanent status. While I thank Ms. Lawrence for her amendment, this amendment fails to address the issue of the need for longer probationary periods. As mentioned, we have heard from numerous groups about the need to extend the probationary period in order to provide supervisors adequate time to evaluate the job performance of new hires. Because this amendment does not provide the needed change to the probationary period that the American people deserve, I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to support this amendment. As I sit here and I listen to what we're saying, I've now managed employees for about 40 years, 20 as a head of a small law firm and 20 in government. And Ms. Lawrence is right. I think what happens is all of us forget that there was a time when all of us were new at whatever we're doing. And I found that in many instances you can see an employee maybe not doing the right thing. And I don't mean egregious things. I mean just maybe not performing as well as you expect them to. But if there's one thing I've learned in managing folks is that they need to know what your expectations are, and you kind of need to know what theirs are too. And I often say that relationships, work relationships, any relationship, will likely fail if people don't know what the expectations are of each other. Because what happens is that when somebody lets the other person down, it's assumed that they knew. Well, maybe they didn't know. Sometimes it may be on the part of a manager not properly training folks. I think what Ms. Lawrence is trying to get to is just not the government side of it, but the human side of it. That is, making sure that if people, first of all, that they're given notice so that if they are not doing what they're supposed to do, they can move on and get another job. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Lawrence. But the other thing that we're talking about is trying to make sure that the person gets the training and that the agencies are doing what they are supposed to do so that that person can be more effective and efficient. That's what it boils down to. We, around here we talk a lot about how we want to spend the taxpayers' dollars effectively and efficiently. Well, I'll tell you, one of the things you've got to do is make sure that people are properly trained. And I guarantee you that it would make a difference. I think that we may be here extending the period to 2 years is going a bit far for every employee. I think that's going a bit far, and I stand to support the gentleman's amendment.
I thank the gentleman. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. You'll hear no argument from me that management needs to do a better job training. You'll get no argument from me that oftentimes the expectations are not conveyed. You throw people right into what they're doing without the proper training explanation. I get that. I'd like to improve that, but at the same time, I do think there is a need. It's reasonable in its time. There are some very complex jobs out there. FAA, for instance, we've been chatting with them. It takes a year and a half or so till they're actually properly trained up. There are IRS officials who have to deal with very complex tax cases. And you really don't know how somebody's going to act until maybe they actually get out in the field. You may go through training and getting a familiarization with how an agency and organization works. But then when you're actually put out on the line, you have to go out and do it yourself. That's a whole other set of circumstances that some people do pretty well and other people just don't do really well. The citation of the 3,000 or so employees that were let go in the first year, that's a startling low number, actually, if you think about it, with the employee base of more than 2 million people. The fact that very few of these people actually get addressed, that's actually struck me as a fairly small number. But I do think there are a number of very complex jobs out there that do require, and even some that I wouldn't necessarily expect or know. And so those are two that come to mind that we've dealt with time and time again. But if you look at the EPA, if you look at the Secret Service, I mean, we've just did a bipartisan report about how pathetic and inept the training is. You know, the average training time for a Secret Service agent and officer is 25 minutes per year. That's their annual training, 25 minutes. So, you know, it kind of scares me on that regard. So let's work together on that aspect. But giving some flexibility here, as Mr. Buck is suggesting in this piece of legislation, I think is well advised. And I would urge a no vote on the amendment with all due respect, but I do support the underlying bill. With that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Chairman, would you yield?
Happy to yield to Mr. Cummings.
Yeah, just following up on what you just said about trying to work on this training piece. What did you have in mind, Mr. Chairman? That we might be able to do together to.
I'm all ears. We won't necessarily solve it right here on this dais, but giving some flexibility to go through extending this probationary period, I do find is warranted. What the specifics on the training look like, I'm not exactly sure, but I do see the need on that aspect as well.
Thank you.
Ms. Watson-Coleman is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of quick comments. While you're extolling the virtues of this proposal in terms of giving individuals more time to learn their job, we're ignoring the fact that it also places these probationary employees in a position where they have less rights and less access for appeal purposes. So it will also have a negative impact, and particularly on whistleblowers. And number two is, for 28 years, for 26 of my 28 years in state government, I managed other people. And then as a legislator on the state level, I manage many other people. And it is important that we, first of all, hire the people who are qualified for the job. Then we train them in how to apply their skills and knowledge and education to the job at hand. And if we can't do that in a year, then that says something about management, not the employee. And so this is an arbitrary proposal that it could have been 5 years more, it could have been 3 years more, because there's no evidence associated with just moving it into 1 more year that you will have a better outcome if, in fact, we are referring to problems with the part of management employing its tools. And with that, I'd like to yield some of my time to the gentle lady, Mrs. Lawrence. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. There's a couple things that also is tied to this 2-year period. In majority of federal employment, you do not get certain benefits until you are considered past the probationary period and deemed a permanent employee. So understand what we're doing to employees that we're hiring. And I feel that the burden of identifying a competent, qualified employee rests in the hands of management, but we're punishing this new employee. Because if I am meeting the expectations, why would you need another full year to evaluate me? If I'm not making it, you shouldn't even need a year if you're doing your job. And also, the technical jobs that was referred to by our chairman, there are past failure elements built into that. So if I want to be a Secret Service agent, there are some clearly defined pass, fail, do I meet this competency? There's testing throughout before you can even be qualified to be designated in permanent employment. So we have all these technical jobs that we're talking about that have built-in factors. But there are some administrative and clerical jobs that you really just need a manager to say, can this person report to work on time? Can this person perform the duties? Is this person committed to the objectives and the outcomes of this company? And if we really hold our management accountable, they can clear out those who should be there and shouldn't. And I just wanted to push back on the analogy that that's a low number. When you have a low number of people being separated, that's a compliment to your personnel department that they did the proper screening before even bringing that person in. And if you have a large number of people being dismissed, then you need to look at your hiring process. What are you doing to ensure that the people that you bring into the door to offer a job has been properly vetted? So I would say that I would push back on that. And we are in the business of providing employment to people in our federal government. And this is a team effort. Management doing their proper assessment, holding employees accountable with clear, defined expectations. And I'll yield back my time.
If the gentlewoman would yield to me, yes, Ms. Watson-Coleman's time. Yeah, thank you, thank you. There is no, I think, incentive to bring on somebody who's a non-performer and then just try to kick them out as soon as possible. There are a host of other jobs as somebody's moving along that we don't know how they're going to perform. We don't know that until they actually are able to learn the complexity of the job and then to start to go out on their own. And we've heard several of these examples along the way, everything from the EPA to the DEA to the FAA to what now the Pentagon is taking on as put forward in the NDAA. So a lot of acronyms there. We're just trying to, I think, do the reasonable thing here, and we've heard this complaint. We're trying to address it, and anyway, I yield back. in the balance of my time. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? If not, are there amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Michigan. Those in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3023, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3023 would assist the committee in determining whether an extension of the current one-year employee probationary period is necessary. The amendment would require the Government Accountability Office to conduct a study of Federal agencies that have lengthened the employee probationary period from 1 to 2 years and for certain occupations. It would require GAO to analyze the impact of the increased probationary period on each agency's ability to deal with poor performers, to improve employee productivity, recruitment, and retention, and to accomplish its mission. Since Congress recently increased the Defense Department's probationary period for civilian employees from 1 to 2 years, this amendment would require GAO to examine the Defense Department as one case study. GAO also would be required to determine whether certain occupations in the Federal Government should have probationary periods beyond 1 year because of their complexity, sensitivity, or unique occupational challenges. GAO would need to examine whether a probationary period extension would give supervisors sufficient time to adequately assess employees' performance and whether such an extension would lead to measurable improvements in employee performance. GAO would have to identify the specific occupations and characteristics of such occupations that would benefit from longer probationary periods. GAO would be required to report the results of its study to this committee and the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs 2 years after enactment. I strongly believe that we need to take this first step of gathering the data before deciding to change the law, especially since such changes could have damaging effects on civil service protections and whistleblower disclosures. I therefore ask my committee colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment in the nature of a substitute, and with that I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This troubling amendment completely strikes the text of the bill, H.R. 3023, legislation that extends the probationary period for positions in the competitive service and the senior executive service so that there is sufficient opportunity to evaluate an employee's job performance. In place of the current bill text, the amendment would insert a provision requiring the Government Accountability Office to conduct a study on Federal agencies that have lengthened the employee probationary period from 1 to 2 years. While I thank the ranking member for his amendment, I do not believe a study on the length of the probationary period that the GAO would be given 2 years to complete is the right course of action. Extending the probationary period allows the government the time necessary to evaluate employees and to ensure that employees serve taxpayers' best interests. We have heard from numerous groups about the need to extend the probationary period in order to provide supervisors adequate time to evaluate the job performance of new hires. For example, the committee has received a letter of support for H.R. 3023 from the Professional Managers Association, which has also offered specific examples of how an extended probationary period would help evaluate IRS revenue agents. These agents undergo a lengthy 2-year training process, but as the Association points out, it is more costly to make a hasty decision and keep someone that would not be an asset to the organization and mission. Because this amendment seeks to deter needed change on behalf of the American people, I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? The gentleman from Pennsylvania is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join in supporting the the effort to change this bill. The point of the point of the amendment is really to study this question. This is a monumental change we're making. And I want to join the ranking member in his comments. He mentioned being the head of a small law firm for 20 years, and I was too. And you know, when you hire somebody, you're taking a chance. You're taking a chance that they're going to work hard and they're going to uphold the values and the integrity of the place where you're working, and help you pursue the dream that you have for your company or your firm. And you're taking a chance that this person will uphold those ideals that you're pursuing. And so you interview them carefully. You research their background, you look at their resume, you talk to the references, you get a good sense for whether this man or woman will be the right fit for the job. And it makes you very careful, because you don't want to waste the time, you don't want to waste your employees' time training somebody who's not going to work out. And so in the private sector, I can speak to this. Employers are very, very careful about who they select for employees at the very outset. But I want to say this. I have never worked at a place or managed a place where we had a probationary period that was longer than 6 months. 6 months is plenty of time to load up the plate of an employee, to find out how that man or woman is going to perform in the job, to find out what that person is made of. And so this idea that we need to rush into changing the law and creating a 2-year probationary period without even studying it, it doesn't make sense to me. And it seems to me that we can lump this on the pile of other efforts to make public sector employees the national whipping boys and girls. I'm against it, and I think that this amendment makes sense, that we ought to study it hard before we rush into this, and therefore I support the amendment, and I'm going to yield to Mr. Connolly of Virginia for a few moments.
I thank my friend from Pennsylvania, and I was listening carefully to what he had to say, and I spent 20 years in the private sector, and I, in that time period, hired a lot of people. And I cannot imagine successfully hiring somebody by telling them, and you'll be on a 2-year probation. I mean, my competition would clean my clock in hiring if that were our policy. Is it not true, I would ask my friend from Pennsylvania, that almost 40% of the federal employment, current employment, is eligible for retirement over the next 10 years?
Exactly.
Is it not true that it's increasingly difficult in a competitive labor environment for us to recruit and retain the workforce of the future, would he say?
Correct.
So this kind of perhaps well-intentioned protection against the incompetent may have the unintended effect, which I think is what my friend from Pennsylvania just said, of actually depressing our ability to hire the skilled workers the federal government is going to need for the future, especially as the baby boom generation retires. Would that be a fair statement, I'd ask my friend?
It would.
So there could be an unintended consequence here, however noble the intent may be. I yield back to my friend from Pennsylvania and thank him so much for illuminating the conversation.
And I thank my friend from Virginia for the comments. The point is this, in hiring, as in every other endeavor in capitalism, you get what you pay for. And if you treat your employees badly and tell them we don't trust you and you're no good and you're suspect, you know, they have other choices. People who are capable and hardworking and intelligent have a whole spectrum of choices, and if we treat them badly, they're going to find other places to work. If we want the best people working for us, the American taxpayers, we have to treat them right. So I support this amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I want to be clear. The overwhelming majority of federal employees are good, hard-working, patriotic people that go to work, pour their heart and souls in, and do amazing things that most of us never hear or see about. But there are some bad apples that get into the system. And the examples that I've heard today about the comparison to small law firms is dramatically different than what happens at the Federal Government. Okay, we have Secret Service advertising for jobs on the back of police vehicles saying, hey, go to this website. You have the TSA advertising on pizza boxes to try to get people to please come fill out an application. At the FAA, you can actually apply to be a flight controller and never even get an interview. They don't even interview the people that are going to the FAA to learn how to be a flight controller. Don't even go through the interview process. Now, I got a huge problem with that. I think that's just ridiculous. I also see that there are metrics out there, and you look at, I think, the turnover rate, and when you have such a low turnover rate in the Federal Government, you're going to have a hard time convincing me that we're unable to retain people over long periods of time. The one exception that I would buy into is in the IT sector. I think that is a highly competitive sector. The competition for that talent, the rates that we pay, I think is something that the committee needs to continue to look at. Mr. Hurd, who has been our subcommittee chairman on the IT subcommittee, I think is something that we really do need to look at. But I do think there is a need, with so many different skill sets that are required and complexity that is, I think, would blow a lot of our minds here on this panel, to extend that probationary period for new people and just explain to them that's the way it is at the beginning and give that flexibility. And I do think there is an urgent need. I don't think it's something that we should continue to punt, and that's at least the way I see it. So with all due respect, I would urge a no vote on this amendment, but I do support the underlying bill as offered by Mr. Buck. With that, I'll yield back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. A roll call is requested. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Are there any further amendments to the bill? If none, further proceedings on H.R. 3023 will be postponed. Our next item for consideration is H.R. 4358, the Senior Executive Service Accountability Act, and the clerk will designate the amendment.
H.R. 4358, the Senior Executive Service Act.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to yield 5 minutes to recognize the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Walberg, to explain the legislation.
I thank the Chairman. Under the Civil Service Reform Act, the SES was established to ensure that the executive management of the government is responsive to the needs, policies, and goals of the nation, and otherwise is of the highest quality. Senior executives share the opportunity to lead, set policy, and expand the capabilities of their agency. This is a tremendous opportunity and privilege. The members of the SES are leaders of the Federal workforce in a budget-constrained environment. Senior executives must be good stewards of taxpayer dollars so citizens receive the best value for their money. Unfortunately, scandals perpetuated by senior executive branch officials have shown that some senior leaders failed to meet the standards expected of Federal leaders. This committee has held numerous hearings on the lack of accountability in the SES, and it is essential to restore the public's confidence in the government's executive corps. The Senior Executive Service Accountability Act brings much-needed reform to the senior executive service and gives agencies common-sense tools to hold senior leaders more accountable for their taxpayer-funded work. Specifically, this bill extends the probationary period for individuals appointed to the SES from 1 year to 2 years. It promotes fairness by making senior executives subject to suspensions of less than 2 weeks. This is the same employment standards as the employees they supervise. It establishes that members of the SES receive performance requirements in writing before the start of an appraisal period. It eliminates the current loophole that allows an executive who has been removed for poor performance and placed in a new Federal job from retaining their executive salary, which only makes sense. Finally, this bill provides for an expedited removal process for SES due to performance or misconduct. This process for expedited removal was enacted for the Veterans Affairs SES in the Veterans Access, Choice, and Accountability Act, which passed the House with bipartisan support and was signed into law by the President in August of 2014. And I might note that every member of this committee who was there at that time voted for that act with those provisions in it. A majority of Federal workers, including senior executives, are hardworking public servants, as our Chairman has expressed several times. We thank them for the hard work. However, as we've seen repeatedly in hearings before our committee, there are bad actors who have abused their position. The Senior Executive Service Accountability Act is an important step towards holding bad actors accountable and restoring public trust. This legislation is very similar to legislation that passed this committee and the House last Congress, and so I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I understand and I appreciate the intent to improve the accountability of the Federal Government's senior executives. However, I urge this committee and Congress to act very cautiously as we consider reforms to increase the accountability of senior executives government-wide. Rather than rushing ahead so quickly, this committee should first hold hearings on this measure and other personnel-related bills on the agenda today so we can receive input from experts and stakeholders as we carefully examine options for reform. This is especially true given that the measure before us adopts provisions from the Veterans Access, Choice, and Accountability Act of 2014 that sought to address specific problems at the Department of Veteran Affairs. I have significant concern that Mr. Walbert's legislation weakens due process rights and whistleblower protections. One of the bill's provisions adopted from the new VA law would permit an agency to remove an senior executive from the civil service or the SES with only 5 days' notice. The provision would allow for an expedited appeal within 7 days after the adverse action and a decision by an administrative judge within 21 days after the appeal. The administrative judge's decision would be final and not appealable. If the administrative judge is unable to issue a decision within the 21 days, the removal or transfer would be final. Under this expedited process, an SES employee would not have the opportunity to respond prior to removal or transfer, and his appeal rights would be extremely limited. This provision would not provide fair and meaningful due process. The provision would also eliminate the authority of the Merit Systems Protection Board or an administrative judge to issue a stay. This provision would enable retaliation against whistleblowers and is clearly contrary to the committee's strong support and commitment to protecting whistleblowers. The constitutionality of identical provisions in the new VA law are currently being challenged in the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. Another provision in the bill would shorten the required time period for agencies to give advanced written notice to a senior executive of an adverse action from 30 days to 15 days. I'm concerned that this shortened period is not sufficient time to meet due process requirements. When the committee considered Mr. Walberg's bill in the last Congress, the Office of Personnel Management raised this exact concern. A third provision in the bill would allow agencies to place a senior executive subject to removal or mandatory leave from using the employee's accrued and earned annual leave. This could be considered an unlawful taking of a property right that requires notice and an opportunity to respond. This measure fails to provide such safeguards. My colleague, Ms. Norton, will be introducing an amendment to strike these constitutionally defective provisions. This committee should examine whether improving the ability of agencies to hold senior executives accountable is necessary. But we cannot do so by sacrificing the fundamental right to due process. And we cannot do so by sacrificing whistleblower rights and protections. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Do any other members wish to speak on the underlying bill? The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly am sympathetic to the goal of accountability and holding people to account in senior positions in management in the government. But the example my friend, Mr. Walberg, uses in the last Congress with respect to VA was actually an exception, not a model. We never intended, in support of that, for that to become the new standard for all Federal agencies. Quite the opposite. We made an exception quite clearly. We pointed out that the VA was broken, that there was a backlog, that lives were at risk, that people had made up statistics at the expense of men and women who had served their country in uniform and their families. And therefore, we were making this one-time exception to both make a point and to absolutely engage in the most extreme way with the senior management of the VA to change their standard operating procedure to help benefit the men and women who serve their country. It was never intended as a model. To now come back and say, gee, that worked so well, and the rationale for that was so compelling, we need to expand it to all Federal government. And again, I would use the private sector example. If we did this in the private sector, we'd be very hard-pressed, even with stock options, to attract the best and the brightest to senior management positions. And that's what we ought to be focused on. So while I don't doubt for a minute the sincerity underlying this bill, as H.L. Mencken once said, for every human problem there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. This falls in that category, in my opinion, and I urge my colleagues to reject the seduction of a simple approach. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Does any other member wish to speak on the bill? We're now ready to start the amendment process. Are there any amendments to the bill? I now recognize Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4358, offered by Ms. Norton of the District of Columbia.
The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment, and without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Ms. Norton, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I am very open to changes in the senior executive service. This non-evidence approach goes much too far, and that is why I want to strike sections 3, 6B, 7, 8, and 9. Now, I ask my colleagues to bear in mind, because we've been talking about all Federal employees before this. We're now talking about the senior executive service. Most of these are people in whom the government has invested for years. These are your top people. They are often very, very specialized. So that, for example, when the chairman talked about Secret Service and FAA, this is not entry-level people. These are people that, for the most part, we want to keep because they have worked their way up and at level after level have been found to do well. That's why they're at the next level. I must object strongly to the assumption that because the VA had a problem, not a problem, a serious crisis, much of it based on the recognition of the VA under this administration of new conditions, that must be government-wide. How amazing. These are agencies that have entirely different missions. And I note that Mr. Cummings' amendment, just to get a little evidence, was royally rejected on the 2-year probationary period. The GAO, for example, has looked at the probationary period, and it has found not that the probationary period needs to be longer, but that it needs to be more effectively used. 3,500 people, employees, were dismissed during the probationary period. And it does seem to me, I remember when the last bill was being explained, it was said that some supervisors were not aware that the probationary period, when it ended, my heavens. So the answer to that is to let it go longer. These are people who shouldn't be in the job, especially if it's a senior job, and especially if they've worked their way up. We ought to know it, and we ought to know it within the time allowed, and we ought to, not for a moment, extend that period. Which brings me to the next part of the bill that I object to, beyond the extension of the probationary period for SES employees. And it is also problematic. This bill would say that although the government is invested in these employees, if somehow during the probationary period they do not live up to what we expected, off with their heads, not as is the case now, downgrading these employees to where they came from. Look, they could have been perfectly competent in the mission, but when it came to supervising a whole fleet of employees, that's a different kettle of fish. So you try them out, you see if they are as good, let us say, at supervision as they were at the underlying matter, and if they're not, then you take them back to where they really were good, which is why they were promoted in the first place. Remember, these are employees in which the government has invested over the years. Now, Section 7 represents a serious constitutional issue because it goes to vested leave, earned leave. Some of what this bill would do is already in the courts, and we're going willy-nilly ahead with saying that these SEA employees would have to be put on mandatory leave that the government says you now must use, taking their property right in the leave that they have earned. That is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Going on to Section 8, we get straight into federal employees' due process rights and the expedited removal and appeals process that adopts provisions of other laws that are now in the Federal Circuit under challenge. It requires somehow the dumping of SES employees to other jurisdictions without thinking about whether that suits the needs of the various parts of the agency. And this is in spite of the fact that the President has signed an executive order, and I'm almost through, an executive order that would strengthen the SES by requiring agency heads to develop a 2-year plan for increasing the mobility of SES employees. That's the way to do it, not just dump them from one location to another. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman yields back. Members are advised that we anticipate we might be done with the markup by 1 o'clock. But if not, if we get done shorter than that, it's the anticipation of the Chair to give a time certain for the roll call votes And so we will anticipate doing that promptly, right at 1 o'clock. If we are continuing with the markup, we may go past 1 o'clock, and then we'll do it at the conclusion. What I'm trying to signal to members is that the roll call vote will be no sooner than 1 p.m., but we're going to try to start it at 1:00. With that, we will now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg, for 5 minutes on the Norton Amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's been interesting hearing the concerns expressed about everything from competition with the private sector. I don't see it as a positive for government to compete with the private sector. I think the private sector is having a challenging time right now and needs the quality people that they can get to compete against all of the challenge they have with the government that comes down on them. I also don't see that we're having a problem acquiring people to serve in these positions. And again, I think my colleagues on the other side of the aisle make a point that not all SES officials are causing problems, and probably know about their ability far sooner than 2 years, for instance. And yet, we've had hearing after hearing in front of this committee and subcommittees looking at wasted taxpayer resources as a result of SES employees not doing their job adequately or violating the public trust in carrying out their job. This amendment by my colleague, the gentlelady from D.C., just simply guts H.R. 4358, the Senior Executive Accountability Act. Again, to just reiterate that, specifically, the amendment strikes the following. It strikes the shift to a 2-year probationary period for SES employees, the authority for agencies to remove SES employees for such cause as would promote the efficiency of the service, the reduction to the requirement that agencies provide SES advance written notice of termination or suspension for more than 14 days from a minimum of 30 days to a minimum of 15 days, mandatory leave for career appointees subject to removal, expedited removal of career appointees for performance misconduct, and mandatory reassignment of career appointees. This amendment removes the authority needed by agency leaders to ensure individuals appointed to the SES are held accountable and continue to meet the executive qualifications required of career appointees. Again, there's concern that this amendment removes the expedited process for removal of career appointees for misconduct or performance-related issues, which again I'd reiterate is similar to the provisions of the VA Access, Choice, and Accountability Act that again looked at some extreme discrepancies and problems in the VA. But we saw it as a need there. I believe it works across the board and across the public sector as well. Because this amendment does not provide the reform needed to the SES, I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any other further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Kelly is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to yield time to Representative Norton.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
I appreciate the comments of the author of the bill. It's precisely because this bill is so comprehensive that we need to move away from anecdotal evidence, particularly evidence based on the misconduct of an agency SES person here and there. Now, this committee does have hearings when there has been misconduct, and I applaud the committee for doing so. But we have not had comprehensive hearings on the SES. These agencies often have nothing in common, and this bill lumps them all together and in fact requires a remedy based on no evidence at all. Indeed, when the ranking member wanted to get a little evidence on the probationary period, his amendment was roundly defeated. Yes, I endorse the notion of hearings, but not only the kind of hearings we have been having. When agency misconduct arises, and then, of course, basing legislation, just throwing at the entire SES what we have learned from the misconduct of an SES member. So I would urge comprehensive hearings before we do comprehensive legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? Gentleman from Maryland, the ranking member, Mr. Cummings.
Chairman, I support the amendment to H.R. 4358, the amendment by Ms. Norton. The Congresswoman's amendment would strike Section 6B, 7, and 8 in the underlying bill. These provisions are constitutionally deficient because they fail to provide sufficient notice and an opportunity to respond. The amendment also strikes a provision that would mandate an arbitrary across-the-board extension of the probationary period from 1 year to 2 years. During this period, an agency could remove or retaliate against an employee without recourse. This is not something members of this Congress should support. Ms. Norton's amendment also would strike a provision requiring agencies to reassign senior executives to different locations every 5 years. I support efforts to increase the mobility of the Federal Government's senior executives. But this mandate is arbitrary and inflexible, and it would not allow an agency discretion to consider its needs or the developmental needs of its senior executives. The mandate is also unnecessary. The President recently issued an executive order to strengthen the senior executive service, and it requires agencies to establish a 2-year plan for increasing the mobility of its senior executives. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the amendment. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Is there any other discussion on the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from the District of Columbia. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? If none, the question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 43582 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The next pardon, there is a roll call requested on that. So further proceedings on H.R. 4358 will be postponed. Next item for consideration is H.R. 4360, the Official Personnel File Enhancement Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4360 to amend Title V United States Code to provide that a Federal employee who leaves government service while under personnel investigation shall have a notation of any adverse findings under such investigation placed in such employee's official personnel file and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I'll yield myself 5 minutes to explain this piece of legislation. It's a bill that would increase accountability within the civil service. If an employee under investigation resigns to avoid an adverse action or finding, the bill requires a notation be made in the individual's official personnel file if the adverse finding or action is finalized after the employee's resignation. While this may seem somewhat trivial, it's a loophole that needs to be closed. Recently, Federal employee union officials have even encouraged people under investigation to resign as a way to apply for a Federal job at another agency with a clean slate. This is unacceptable. This practice will end if this bill is implemented. Not only does the bill require notation of adverse actions in the personnel file, but it also requires agencies to examine the personnel files of former Federal employees before hiring them. It's a simple bill designed to stop a very specific problem, and I'd urge my colleagues in order to support this. If somebody is being paid by the taxpayers and they're engaged in service, we would assume that the overwhelming majority, most of them, the majority, are good quality people and they're going to have good positive notations in their file. But there are people that do some silly, stupid stuff. They get caught, and it should be notated as such. And if you simply switch jobs and go from one part of the Federal Government to another federal part of the government, another part of the Federal Government, that record should follow you. That's how we know the type of person and the type of employee that you might be. That's what we're trying to get at. We have heard some horror stories, and we're trying to address this with this piece of legislation. And with that, I'll yield back. Now I recognize the Ranking Member, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I oppose this legislation in its current form. In this committee's hearings over the past several years, we've seen a few examples of employees who have resigned or retired before administrative discipline was formally imposed. And all of us have been upset about these instances. This committee has focused on bad apples, and some of their conduct has been indeed egregious. But with a federal civilian workforce of more than 2 million employees, the bad apples examined in our hearings represent a minuscule percentage. No one likes the idea of an employee under investigation resigning only to reapply for employment at another federal agency. But before we propose a solution, especially one that could have serious due process ramifications, we need to understand the extent of the problem. Placing a notation in a personnel file that an employee has resigned under investigation is a serious action. In all likelihood, such a notation would prevent future federal employment. That's why we should have had a hearing on this before considering it today. There are no provisions in the bill allowing an employee who resigns or retires pending an investigation to challenge an adverse finding. I'm concerned that under this bill, an employee who is innocent might receive a negative notation in his or her file. Failing to give an employee the opportunity to respond to an adverse finding violates due process and undermines the fundamental American principle that a person is presumed innocent until proven guilty. I understand that Representative Connolly will offer an amendment that would extend due process protections to an adverse notation in a personnel file. With that, I yield back.
Does any other member wish to speak on the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4360, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment, and without objection, the amendment is considered read.
I thank the Chair. I can appreciate the impetus behind this legislation. During the course of numerous investigations, our committee has occasionally come across employees who are under investigation, who have resigned or retired before any disciplinary action could be imposed. Naturally, we don't want to provide an opportunity for such individuals to agency hop without some record of their personnel file of such investigations with an adverse finding. However, as currently drafted, I fear the bill provides no opportunity, as the Ranking Member has just indicated, for rebuttal or appeal for the separated employee. Just take, if we're going to talk about anecdotes, the example of the whistleblower, who may be punished or find retribution for his or her willingness to throw the flag down when something untoward is going on in his or her agency. I'm also concerned that an employee who turns out to be innocent could wind up with a negative notation in their employee file, which would no doubt preclude them from future federal service. My amendment would strike a balance by affording due process rights to such employees, including providing them an opportunity to respond in writing to the investigation and appeal any decision to the Merit Systems Protection Board. It would allow a notation to be placed in the personnel file so long as it acknowledges that an appeal is pending and its eventual outcome. I'd ask my colleagues to consider to support this addition in the interest of fairness and preserving workplace protections and employee rights. With that, I yield back.
I think the gentleman yields back, and I will recognize myself. I think I'm inclined to support this amendment. I appreciate the sincerity and the approach the gentleman's taking. I think that's fair, balanced, and reasonable. And I would encourage my colleagues to support the amendment. I recognize the yield to the ranking member, Mr. Cummings.
Let's stop while we're ahead.
Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time.
I thank the gentleman for those powerful words.
I'm going to reconsider here. You compliment me too much, or I'm not going to oppose it. So, yeah. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank my good friend and colleague, Mr. Conley, for his insightful amendment, and certainly for trying to put a balanced approach on having a workforce that is accountable, but also one that certainly deserves the support of the American people. And I would encourage my colleagues to support the amendment as well. And I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Any other discussion on the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? If none, the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman for Virginia as amended. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments to the bill? If none, the question is now on the adoption of favorably reporting H.R. 4360 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The final bill under consideration is H.R. 4359, the Administrative Leave Reform Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4359, to amend Title V United States Code to provide that Federal employees may not be placed on administrative leave for more than 14 days during any year for misconduct or poor performance and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I yield myself 5 minutes to explain this piece of legislation. The committee, over the course of the past year, and certainly before that, has heard a number of cases in which a Federal employee has committed some form of misconduct. We can list a whole host of them. And then remains on administrative leave for months at a time, in some cases years. Just in the last day or two, we hear about, at the VA, for instance, somebody who, more than one person, had been on administrative leave, I believe, for 19 months. Abusive, I think one person had been on administrative leave for years. Abusive administrative leave is a problem. In fact, the Federal Managers Association has expressed support for examining the use of administrative leave throughout the Federal Government. The Administrative Leave Reform Act caps the use of administrative leave at 14 days per calendar year for cases related to misconduct or performance. This review is to prevent individuals from remaining on administrative leave in perpetuity, allowing them to receive pay while not doing any work. It is a common-sense bill that limits the amount of time that an employee can be on administrative leave for misconduct or performance. Too often, the committee, we hear about these horrific stories. One of the more controversial cases relates to Lois Lerner. She sat on administrative leave for 4 months before retiring. Yet, unfortunately, Ms. Lerner is not alone, and dozens of individuals who are under investigation for significant misconduct remain on administrative leave for longer than is necessary to complete an investigation. One major reason is that in some cases, agencies may see it as easy to just prolong an investigation rather than wait for it to be resolved for any outcome. Troubling, this means that some individuals face little to no penalty for significant misconduct. And all too often, this is used as a tool to simply let them get to a certain point in retirement where they can maximize their benefits, which is a severe cost to the American people. For example, the Inspector General for the EPA found that the EPA's use of administrative leave was disproportionately compared to OPM's guidance related to use for unacceptable performance and misconduct. In one instance, an employee confessed to, quote, knowingly and intentionally engaging in sexual conduct with a child younger than 17 years, end quote, in the 1990s. After the employee was arrested on a probation violation, that individual was put on administrative leave in August of 2013, accrued 300 hours of paid leave before being removed from the agency. Further, the employee was rehired from September 2014 through January 2015 with, quote, no documentation, end quote, in the employee's disciplinary action file. Another EPA Inspector General report found that an employee earning $120,000 annually who was watching pornography on the job. This employee was placed on administrative leave for a year before being fired. And you just can't explain the justification for leaving somebody on administrative leave, being paid fully by the taxpayers for a year after this. It's totally unacceptable. The legislation would limit the use of administrative leave for misconduct or performance to 14 days per year in order to push agencies to complete investigations swiftly. This is fair to the employee, it's fair to the taxpayers, and I think it's the right thing to do. I'd urge my colleagues to support this measure. With that, I'll yield back. Now I recognize the Ranking Member, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this legislation in its current form. I agree that the agency's overuse of administrative leave can be a problem. We have seen evidence of that in this committee's hearings over the past several years. This committee has held a series of hearings focused on bad apples in the Federal Government, highlighting rare but egregious examples of misconduct in the Federal workforce. However, this committee has failed to hold a hearing on the solutions. That's why I wrote the Chairman last week asking for a legislative hearing on the personnel bills we are marking up today. I ask unanimous consent that a copy of that letter be made a part of the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so
ordered. Thank you. Now, we have had testimony about the problems, and now we need to hear from the stakeholders about the solutions. There are many ideas out there about streamlining the disciplinary process, and this committee should thoroughly consider them. Our committee's hearings and continued oversight have already resulted in agencies utilizing existing authorities to streamline disciplinary procedures. In November of last year, Democratic members of this committee sent a letter to the Council of Inspectors General on integrity and efficiency. This letter described a new process at the Environmental Protection Agency to facilitate communication between the agency and its Inspector General. The letter requested that the Council survey its members to determine if similar procedures are in place at other agencies. It also asked them whether they believe those procedures could improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the disciplinary process, and whether Inspectors General could identify other best practices. I believe there are ways agencies can streamline the disciplinary process while preserving due process protections for Federal employees. However, one thing that is clear is that this bill is not the right way to fix problems with administrative leave. The bill does one thing. It prohibits an agency from placing an employee on administrative leave for investigative purposes for more than 14 days. The bill does not provide direction to an agency after those 14 days have expired. Does the employee go back to work? Is the employee put on leave without pay? This legislation does not answer those questions. I have concerns that this bill might provide an end run around the due process protections required before an employee is suspended or placed on leave without pay. Due process is critical to protecting all Federal employees, but particularly whistleblowers, on whom we rely to expose waste, fraud, and abuse. The committee's bipartisan report on the United States Secret Service cites the results of the 2015 Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, which found that, I quote, Secret Service employees increasingly believe they cannot report misconduct without fear of retaliation, end of quote. Employees need to feel confident that they can report misconduct without arbitrary reprisal. We need to ensure a process is in place that will protect whistleblowers, not encourage agencies to rush to discipline employees. I understand that Representative Lynch will offer an amendment to clarify that following the 14 days of administrative leave, an agency must return an employee to duty, even if that means the employee must telework. The bill addresses a legitimate problem, but it's not the right solution. Chairman, I oppose the Administrative Leave Reform Act as it is currently drafted, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any members who wish to speak on the bill? Recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding time to me, and I'm honored to speak on behalf of the Administrative Leave Reform Act. And I'm sure, Mr. Chairman, really this has come about because time and time again we have seen cases where Federal employees are being placed on indefinite leave rather than being terminated for misconduct or poor performance. And I strongly support this legislation. I believe it will put an end to this shameful practice. But with the Chairman's indulgence, I would like to take the opportunity to raise a similar issue that I've been working with the committee, and that is official time. For those who may not be familiar with official time, it's a practice where Federal employees are hired by whatever agency, the IRS, VA, what have you. But then instead of doing the job they were hired to do, they end up working for the union, the Federal union, and of course all of this is on the backs of taxpayers. Official time allows for Federal employee unions to collectively bargain with their agency, arbitrate grievances, and organize or carry out internal union activities, again, all on the backs of taxpayers. The amount of official time that's used in Federal government is staggering. This practice currently accounts for about 3.4 million man-hours each year on activities that have nothing to do with the job that these individuals were hired to do. In fact, from 1998 to 2012, the abuse of official time has grown by 1.2 million man-hours, while actually the number of Federal employees represented by unions has decreased during that same period of time. In fact, there are several Federal agencies that have many employees that do nothing but union activities, and in spite of being hired to do other jobs. For example, the Department of Veterans Affairs and the IRS have over 200 employees who operate exclusively on official time, doing 100% of their jobs for union work rather than that for which they were hired. And many of these employees are extremely well paid. The Department of Transportation, for example, has 35 employees with an average salary of $138,000 a year, and they are using 100% of their time for official time. As a point of reference, Mr. Chairman, the mean household expense income in my district is approximately $62,000 a year. So the practice of official time essentially means that taxpayers are being forced to subsidize union activities of Federal employees. And Federal employee union members, they pay their own dues, and the taxpayers should not be required to foot the bill for their union activities. In addition, there's a great lack of reporting on this issue, that so much so that it's unclear exactly how much official time is being used by Federal employees. And we are left in this committee to rely on oftentimes year-old reports from the GAO or FOIA requests. I was pleased to join the Chairman and Congressman Meadows in sending a letter to Federal agencies requesting detailed information on how the use of official time is being used with their employees. And I've also introduced legislation to help curtail official time, H.R. 1658, the Federal Employee Accountability Act. I encourage all my colleagues here to look at that piece of legislation. I'd like to thank the Chairman and the committee for working with my staff and me to advance this issue, and I look forward to continuing this work in the coming weeks and months. Again, I firmly stand behind the Administrative Leave Reform Act, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I thank the Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. After some discussion here on the dais, I think it's probably in best interest of both to withdraw the bill at this time. I do think there is a problem that needs to be addressed, and I look forward to working on a bipartisan way to come to a resolution where we can have something that will pass not only this committee, but pass the body as a whole.
Gentleman yields.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for that. I'm sure that Mr. Lynch feels the same appreciation. We do see a problem. We just want to make sure we come up with a reasonable and balanced solution. So with that, I yield back.
I appreciate it, and I work with Mr. Meadows, Mr. Heiss, and others, any others that have an interest in this. And I do think it would be in the best interest to take a little bit more time. So,
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Lynch is now recognized.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Yeah. Just momentarily, I appreciate that. I think we can work out a good solution that would comply with the due process requirement of the Constitution. I do not want people to misunderstand that this bill, the Administrative Leave Reform Act, has anything to do with the use of official time by union officials. And that is totally extraneous to what we're talking about here. So I appreciate the gentleman's comments, and I'm happy to work with him. Thank you. I yield back.
Understood. Thank you. I'd ask unanimous consent to withdraw this bill. Without objection, so ordered. The committee will stand in recess and convene promptly at 1 p.m. That's 1:00 for those of you who, that means you need to start walking here about 1:45, okay? We anticipate a minimum of 2 votes and as many as 3 votes. We look forward to seeing you again at 1 o'clock. The committee stands in recess.